the intersection of biogeochemical cycles. Thank you, Lynn. Soils are the intersection of biogeochemical cycles. Which is really amazing, right? We're going to talk about erosion, and so sort of the obvious one is the water cycle, right? We have atmospheric water. It comes down into the earth as rain. It goes off as rivers. It hangs out in the ocean. It evaporates, and it's this cycle, right? It's like you can sort of chase those molecules around, and sometimes they stay in one place for longer. Sometimes they leave that pool more quickly, but it's moving through that. And something that I think a lot about in the work that I do at the scale of the soil interface with the air is what happens when that first raindrop comes shooting down from space and hits the soil, right? There's this point of impact. And if you're at the scale of a microbe, that point of impact is a major event in your life, right? It's like, imagine if there was a raindrop proportionally, if we were a microbe and the raindrop came down, it would destroy our house potentially, right? If we scaled that out. But what's amazing is that there's so many ways that microbe generate squishy stuff that holds soil together, that often that raindrop can come down, and instead of blasting the soil structure apart, it can soak it in. And that difference is so key to so much of what we think about with regenerative agriculture. NCAT has a whole soil for water program where it's that difference. What's going to happen? Are we going to explode the soil and it's going to run off, or is it going to seep in and be available to the plants and the roots? The water cycle, right? We have this big picture of things cycling. We have that first impact of that raindrop hitting the soil surface. But back at that big scale, we also have the timing, frequency, and duration of rainfall events, right? So are we getting lots of little events? Are we getting one deluge? How long is it lasting at a time? How long is the season that these rainfalls are lasting? All of those have really meaningful ecological impacts on the species that are trying to live in that system. And all of those are changing because of climate change, right? We're getting differences in duration, magnitude, and frequency. So what's going to happen to all of the soil processes that we rely on to feed ourselves? Right? There are many other biogeochemical processes that are all intersecting here. We have the energy cycle, where the solar energy of the sun is combining with photosynthesizers to bring the carbon dioxide out of the air, put it into the plant material, which then goes out into the soil. And that's really important. The carbon cycle is probably the next most important thing that we're going to think about in this talk, because that's where life is. It's where life and death is, right? So we have the living organisms that are actively processing the materials, and then we have the dead organisms that are sort of being acted on, right? Or the manure, right? The things that came from life and are now being part of this biogeochemical cycling. And then of course we have nutrients and volcanoes, radiation. Yeah. So, and all of that is happening at the level of the soil. Great. So to take that huge concept and really focus in on what's happening at the soil, we have all of these interacting mechanisms. We have the soil being mineral particles, what we think of as dirt, right? That the actual quartz and silica and those minerals, they're often inert. They're not from life, but they're there. They're the structure of the soil. And that's of course interacting with the living organisms. That's where, the worms are burrowing through the soil, that structure. And then of course they're leaving behind organic material, so living and dead material. And then soil is the medium for plant growth, right? Which is often when we're in agriculture, that's what we're going for, either to grow forage for livestock or to grow crops. So that's that zoomed in view. And then what's important is that these mechanisms happen in space and changes happen through time. And so what that means for us when we're thinking about erosion is it matters if you're on the top of a hill and things are eroding away, or if you're at the bottom of a hill and things are accumulating on top of you. That's what we mean by space matters. And then the time component is where, are things changing at a geologic time scale, or is it happening really rapidly? And what's the cause of it? Is it something that we're doing that is accelerating a process that we maybe don't want to be going so quickly? Or is something we're doing management-wise slowing things down and giving us a chance to prevent erosion, right? So this framework is something I'll keep coming back to throughout this talk. And I think that's important to think. It's not just what's there at a snapshot moment. We're thinking how it relates to other parts of the system and how it relates through time.
Hey, Eva,
yeah.
I think you've got some like Zoom notifications that are blacking out your title on the slides.
Oh, heavens. I was just going to check the chat to see if anything was amiss. Thank you. Okay.
That's perfect. Yep, thanks.
Great. All right, so we're going to use New Mexico as a case study. And starting with what I have here at the top left, erosion is a major issue for people who are doing agriculture in New Mexico. According to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, it's the #4 rangeland resource concern. So all the people in the state, this is the thing that bothers them the 4th most. And the #1 is low plant productivity. And what we talked about at that first figure is that these biogeochemical cycles interact and overlap, right? And so the fact that we have lots of erosion sets us up for a negative feedback cycle where we have erosion, plant productivity is reduced, we have less plants, and now we have more erosion. So it's this negative feedback cycle, which has been happening, which we can see with this next statistic from NRCS, where New Mexico has the highest average bare ground, and it has increased at the highest rate over the last 2 decades or so. And so again, what we're witnessing is this negative feedback cycle. And so what we are going to head towards in the rest of this talk is how can we do a management intervention that short circuits that negative feedback cycle and hopefully starts a positive feedback cycle. But in the meantime, before we get there, let's also talk about some major things that have been happening in the state. We've had the largest wildfire in state history this year. And what people are finding is that it's actually a 1-2 punch almost always. You have a large fire and then you have erosion when the rains do come. And so it's makes it so important for us to find ways, again, to go from those negative feedback cycles to positive feedback cycles, both for building resilience to what already is happening. And then we want to try to find ways to be able to restore function after a catastrophic event. I'm not going to talk any more about fire in this talk. That's outside of the scope, but in the framing, this is why it's important, is because we are facing some major issues in the Southwest. So we want to get towards solutions collectively. So, mention these management interventions. One of the principles that folks at Quivira, long before me, very smart people have been building out is this framework of you work from the top down. So you work at the scale of a watershed. Again, that space and time matters. And that thinking from the top down means that you're going to be addressing things in the order of how much of the feedback you can sort of address, right? If you're right at the bottom of the watershed, literally so much is already rolled downhill, it's already built up steam, and you're trying to address it at the end is not going to be as effective as that sort of point of impact of that raindrop would probably be the most effective place to slow water down, help it seep into the soil rather than running off. So there are some really wonderful resources that Quivira has that are in higher resolution than this image. Apologies. And so we'll take a look at one of them here in just a minute, but we've got these amazing field guides. The erosion control field guide is like the most useful 11 pages you'll ever buy. These are available on our website for download, or you can buy the hard copies. We've got these amazing erosion control videos. That's something that I've really noticed is challenging, is it's a very three-dimensional problem, and then we try to take photos or something and it's two-dimensional. So the videos really help to move people around and get a sense of how to actually do this. And I'll give you a sense of that in just 1 minute. We'll actually watch one of these. So there's big problems. We've got climate change, we've got things like fire, we've got these negative feedback cycles, and there are potential solutions. So zooming in, I'm going to take another sip of tea. So we did talk about a lot of fairly big scope issues. Let's zoom into what this project is actually addressing, which is actually tenable for a small organization to research. So we were looking at headcuts in erodible lands. And so the headcut is, this potentially could have been an old field, and it's now being bisected by this channel that is moving up slope. And so it's reducing the productivity of that field. Imagine if it's about to affect a road that is connecting key infrastructure. These headcuts can be a real problem because, again, we have that negative feedback cycle. And there are these very simple, low-tech, just grit and elbow grease methods to address this. So we're going to watch. Oops. We're going to switch out here. And if you have seen this already, or if you are already a total expert on these erosion control structures, take about a 5-minute break and then come back. Otherwise, we're going to watch this one together. And I think you can still see this. Great.
A rock rundown is an erosion control structure in which the face of a headcut has been stabilized and then covered with a single layer of rock mulch.
We're in a section of channel that's starting to degrade with a little more rapidity. So essentially it's moving down more quickly. And part of that degradation process is being driven by what we sometimes refer to as a headcut. It's a small nick point in this particular spot, but basically it's just a rapid change in elevation. So we have the channel kind of coming through a little constricted area here. It's coming to a little bit of a straight section where ideally we could put a one rock dam, but because there's this nick point, we have to alter the structure to become a rock rundown. So this is the nick point, or kind of a small headcut formation. The concern here is that as this water is coming down channel from where I'm standing, it is hitting this rapid change in elevation, pouring over, picking up acceleration, and scouring the base. Oftentimes you could think of this as a small waterfall. This is a little less exaggerated than in certain headcuts that you might see on the landscape, but basically this water is scouring at this point, picking up momentum. It's actually stripping enough soil that it's exposing numerous roots, and essentially is furthering the process of incising this channel so that water has no ability to spread out onto the landscape. This is drying the landscape out because we're not slowing and spreading water. We're accentuating it into a channel, and it has no ability to rehydrate the surrounding areas. So at this point, we're going to start the process of building a rock rundown. The idea here is that we're going to address this headcut, or this nick point, by creating a 3-to-1 ramp. Basically, for every 3 units of length, you would kind of create 1 unit of elevation. So it's kind of a fairly gradual ramp. What we're going to do that is we're going to actually pull some of this sediment or this soil off the edges of the channel into the bottom. If this was in a landscape where you were at a large head cut, just kind of in a grassy area, you would actually take the soil from the head cut up channel or up above in that area and use that sediment to pull the slope down. That would be your sediment source to create the ramp. But in this particular case, we've got an incised channel where water is not going to make it up onto these edges, so we'll just pull the soil from off these edges. So we've completed the ramp, and we're going to basically, similar to all structures, we're going to start from the bottom edge and work our way up slope or up channel. One thing to note about a rock rundown is that you kind of want to find the lowest point of that ramp and go just below it where the channel starts to level back out. So basically the point at which the slope changes into a flatter direction, that's called the inflection point. We basically, of that curve, we want to be able to build the first layer or footer or splash pad just below that inflection point before going up channel. So we've got some of the footer built at this point. From here on out, we're going to be building kind of slightly elevated above the ramp elevation and add a little bit of grass seed or some sort of wildflower mix, and basically add a layer of stone 1 rock high up the edges a little bit, maintaining that concave shape and ensuring that the water stays through the center of the structure. But essentially this is the part that was crucial in terms of building the splash pad just below the inflection point, which is about here. So just casting some of the seed through the bottom of the ramp. We'll continue to do that as we move up, but at this point we can start to put the stones on top of that seed, and essentially those stones protect that seed from being carried away by ants or other small insects, and provides a little bit of an increased soil moisture, and then we just build from here. So we're approaching where the nick point used to exist, right at this location. The important thing to do at this point is to make sure that we're not going to build the elevation of the stones above the head cut or the nick point. The reason for that is we want to make sure that water continues to enter through this structure. If we were to build the elevation up, water might try to go around it in certain circumstances. It wouldn't be able to do that in a channel or a rill that's this incised, but in a landscape where there was just a solitary head cut and some grasses above it, the last thing you'd want to do is put all these stones into the structure and ultimately send the water around the entire structure after you complete it. So we're coming to the conclusion of installing this rock rundown. The important things to note again is that we built that great footer at just below the inflection point. We would build a 1 rock dam below that if possible. We've tried to build as much around the existing vegetation, so we've maintained some vegetation within the structure. The structure itself will maintain a little bit of improved soil moisture so that this vegetation should actually thrive over time. We've maintained a concave shape throughout the middle, and kind of to conclude, we'll add a little bit of gravel in between any of the gaps between the stones, and we basically built the top of it up to the original head cut elevation, nothing above it.
Unmute myself. So that's an example of these really excellent videos that Quivira and Southwest Hydrology and folks put out last year. So feel free to watch the rest on your own. But I wanted to give the full context of this was the problem that we're addressing, is these head cuts, and the solution that has been that's sort of common practice right now is these rock rundowns as addressing those. And so let me see, I've got to get back to my slideshow view. There we go. And so when we go back to our sort of framework diagram, what did we address in building that rock rundown? We addressed solid particles, right? We put rocks, we put, these are not alive, they are physical objects that we are using as a tool to address how water moves through space and time, right? So that's great. Did anyone notice anything else that was potentially addressed in the video we just watched? he talked about scattering seeds, right? And so he was addressing actually a second part of that. But when people think about the structures, the rock rundowns, often what people are thinking about is addressing at this level. We are making a physical change to this landscape. So what would happen if we thought really holistically about all of these mechanisms in the soil at the same time? Could we, this is supposed to say, better yet, could we use material that we already have and start addressing some of these other parts of the soil in trying to solve this big problem, which is erosion? So, I just asked this one out of order, but what could we do to increase plant growth? Please feel free to add to the chat if anyone is paying attention. We talked about seeding. He actually mentioned one other thing. Does anyone remember what it is? Go ahead and add to chat if you're thinking about it. I'll do the count to 10 in my head for Zoom. Yeah, talked about gravel as ways of holding water in to support the grass. Yeah, protect the seeds. Yep. He also talked about building around existing vegetation. That's where I was hinting at, is like, you don't pull up the scrawny little grasses that are already trying to grow and already have their roots exposed. They're doing a good job. They're doing the best they can. So let's protect anything that's already alive. And then, yeah, adding seeds. We want to promote plant growth. So there we go, adding seeds. How about organic materials? Any ideas for, and let's specifically call that the non-living organic materials. What could we do? What could we add? What could we do in building these erosion control structures to affect that sort of non-living part of the organic material? Biochar, awesome. Yeah, nice. Improve litter cover. Yeah. Knock some things down. Animal presence. I was wondering if anyone was going to think about that. Yeah, if we could get some nice manure on there to start slowly degrading, get the dung beetles in there. Yeah, we would totally be affecting the soil organic matter. Awesome. Thanks for participating in the chat. In this case, for this project, we used wood mulch. And the idea for this was lots of people have things like juniper or four-wing saltbrush or various woody nuisance plants. And so if you're going to be cutting juniper down anyway, maybe you can use these. Maybe setting them on the soil, maybe chipping them and adding them to the soil might be helpful for slowing down erosion. So this was one of our reasons, again, of if we have something already, could we make it useful towards erosion control? All right, how about living organisms? Is there anything we can do to introduce living organisms to this system? And everyone who knows me will already know the answer that I'm thinking of. All right. Compost question mark. I like it. Compost tea. Nice. Nice. Yeah, I suppose you could dump a bunch of earthworms on there. I don't know if they would survive yet. We probably have to get that feedback cycle going a little bit in the positive direction before macro invertebrates might be too good. But yeah, or yep, nope, I'm gonna stop. I like the suggestion we came up with, but these were these principles, right? So this framework is how we came up with the different treatments that I'm about to talk about. So in this case, we did indeed use compost. We didn't use compost tea, we used actual compost. And I can go into why we didn't use compost tea later if people have specific questions about that. But let's do a side note. Let's go to a side note. So folks in the chat sort of clearly identified some things that are related to organic material but are not alive, things that are microbial, and what is soil. But let's, just in case there are quiet folks who are thinking about this, what's the difference between soil, mulch, and compost? Sometimes in vernacular we sort of say, mix them up. You'll get potting soil and you're like, oh yeah, this is soil. Or you'll get compost and you'll go, oh yeah, this is soil, right? From the grocery or from the hardware store. But they are different. So let's do an experiment. All right. Who used hydrogen peroxide as a kid when you got a cut? Does anyone remember doing that? What happened when you put hydrogen peroxide on a cut? It bubbles. Great. Thank you, Rachel. Yes, it bubbles. This is where me not being the proper chemist that I should be, it is, and a little sting for sure. Yes. So it is breaking apart cell walls of living organisms. And that's why we, it's not common practice to do it anymore, but that's why people use it, is you're trying to kill the bacteria by breaking apart their cell walls. And in the process, we also broke apart some of our cell walls. And that's what bubbles is that reaction produces a gas. Okay, so what we've determined is that when we have life and we add hydrogen peroxide, we get bubbles. Do you all agree? If you have something living, you add hydrogen peroxide, it's gonna bust apart their cell walls and we're gonna get bubbles. Okay, so we'll do an experiment. We'll see how obvious this is on video. They look kind of similar. Okay. So I have got soil from my garden. I have got compost from a commercial compost facility. It also has some big pieces of wood. And then I have mulch, which is just chopped up wood pieces. So which one, if I add hydrogen peroxide, which one will bubble the most and which one will bubble the least? So I've got soil, mulch, and compost. If I add hydrogen peroxide, what's going to happen? Soil bubbles, is it going to bubble the most or is it going to bubble the least? Or somewhere in the middle? Okay, soil is going to bubble the most. I like that hypothesis. Anyone else have a different hypothesis? All right, surface area, okay. Compost is the most, okay. Mulch the least, all right. Anyone else agree with any of these others? I like the idea of surface area. There are certainly other variables that we're not controlling for in my jar experiment, but hopefully I have enough material that hopefully we'll see some differences. All right, so we've got some great hypotheses. If you didn't write them in the chat, hopefully you're thinking about them. All right, here is the soil. I'm gonna get it nice and wet. It is definitely bubbling. I can actually even hear it. Okay, I'm gonna set this down. I'll show you it to you again in a second. Here's compost. Ooh, it got a little hydrophobic because it was sitting and dry. And now it's floating, of course. It is bubbling quite a bit. Starting to. It's actually lifting itself up. The bubbles are huge. Wow, okay. I'll come back to this one also. Here's mulch. Roll this around a little bit. Ooh, this one's actually super bubbly. Maybe I have to mix them all a little more. See if I can hold them all at the same time. Oh, interesting. My mulch is much more alive than I thought it would be. This is why it's actual science. This was just sitting on the top of the soil. I hadn't like mixed it in, but whoever sold me that mulch, that there's stuff that's still alive. But I think we're correct with our mulch is forming the least bubbles. Soil and compost are very alive. Yeah. I am going to say, which I don't know if you can see, the number of big bubbles in the compost is more than the number of big bubbles in the soil. So what I know from my yard is that the place I took this from probably has less microbial activity than this average piece of compost, but it's been rainy. There's more going on here than otherwise. But I really like this demonstration. Ooh, soil and compost. No need to say sorry. So here's soil, here's compost. I'm seeing bigger bubbles. And so soil, but fundamentally, soil includes that mineral component. So we have the sand, silt, and clay, as well as the organic material. But like on a per mass basis, organic material is a much smaller proportion of that mass of soil versus compost that is like 100% organic material, completely filled with microbial activity, billions and billions of cells. So I was expecting that the compost would be like spewing out the top, but I think this has been sitting in my garage too long, and so it got a little sad. So next time I do this, I'll like wet it, like zhuzh it up a little bit first. But anyway, but they are different. Compost is decomposed organic material. The other thing, to think about is like if you throw a apple core and it goes through the composting process, you cannot find that apple core again. It is completely chemically and physically transformed versus soil has that mineral component. Great. That was yet another sidebar. I just love making stinky bubbles in my office. They don't smell too bad. The mulch is a little ripe. All right, so that's, where was I? I got too excited. Oops, okay, compost, full of microbes. That was the point. Compost is full of microbes. And when we think about, again, that we're in common parlance, we kind of mix what we're saying. This is a nice diagram from one of our books where we can think of like wood chips or hay or paper. We can think about their C to N ratio. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is really high. There's a lot of carbon. If you're a microbe, it's going to be hard to like get the nitrogen you need to break down all that carbon. So it usually degrades more slowly on its own. Then there's like manure. We talked about adding animals as a way of adding organic material. That usually has a much lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it's sort of easier to break down. That's also why if you have like feeding operations, the manure can actually impact the waterways because you have so much nitrogen that can leach out. But when you combine them and you compost them, you end up with your finished compost. So again, you can't find the pumpkin in the finished compost because it's been completely transformed by microbes. All right, so might have gotten this too far afield. Let's come back to our diagram, our anchoring diagram. So again, our idea is we take something that works well, armoring the soil, starting from the top and working our way down like we saw in the video. And let's see what happens if we also manipulate some other holistic parts of the soil and see if we can get sort of even better outcomes in controlling erosion. So what we did is we, with very little notice, asked 5 different ranches to participate. So thank you, Emily, for the quick turnaround, for example. And all across New Mexico from up in Tierra Maria all the way down to Carlsbad. So we're getting a range of site history, elevation, soil type, climate, all of that. We're really different. So we wanted to know, are some of these things working better in some places than others? Is it not even worth bothering if you don't have, rain in the summer or whatever? So that's why we used lots of sites. At each of the sites, we added rock rundowns to, I'm going to go with 18 head cuts at each ranch. And so everything, all of the treatments got that rock rundown because that's standard practice in sort of what Quivira has already found that works. And then to those 18, we randomly assign them to one of these treatments. So we have a control, which is just the rock rundown. We add compost, again, adding that living component, or we add mulch, adding that organic component, which is a little less microbial based. And then again, we add no seeds or we add seeds. So we're adding that vegetation part. And even though the common practice is to add seeds, that can be something that's either expensive or sometimes challenging for land stewards to actually get access to quality local seeds. And so what we wanted to know is if we do some of these other things, adding compost or adding mulch, maybe the native seed bank will be okay and we won't need to add any more seeds. So that was sort of why we tried the no seeds versus seeds, is we're mixing this sort of conceptual idea with what's actually practical. Again, what do we have lying around? What's potentially available on the site, for example, mulch, versus what's maybe sort of the cream of the crop, which might be adding compost or maybe compost tea. I'm going to come back to that comment later. All right, so what did these treatments actually look like? So here's one of the rock rundowns. So this one's kind of a little guy. And then up slope of it, again, this principle of top to bottom, we added an additional treatment. So we added the compost or the mulch or the seeding up slope of that. And we wanted, the idea is we slow the water down, we soak it in so that this can recover and start to heal itself, or at least not get any worse, right? First, do no harm. First, we want it to not get any worse. So what did we measure? We clipped above ground biomass to figure out, again, this idea that plant growth is important for both the carbon cycle and the hydraulic cycle interacting. So are we getting more plants grown? Especially where we added seeds. Are any of those seeds coming up and growing? That's important. We looked at ground cover or plant diversity. And we used this transect method. I'm sorry. So the above ground biomass, we put down this square and then we clip everything that is above ground and we put it in a bag, we dry it and we weigh it. We have the actual mass of what was growing above ground. Sorry, got ahead of myself. So for this ground cover or plant diversity, we use the transect method. And this is, again, where you sort of think like a raindrop. You put a measuring tape down, and then at designated intervals, you drop a pin, and in your brain, you're thinking, if I'm a raindrop, what am I hitting first? Am I hitting a shrub, then bouncing off the shrub, and then hitting a grass leaf, and then hitting litter, and then hitting bare soil? Or am I coming straight down onto bare soil that's not been armored in any way? And so this transect method can both tell you what's right at the soil surface, but as well as what's on top of it. So what might break that impact of that single raindrop. And that also gives you some of the plant diversity and cover. We also took soil samples. I'm not really going to talk about soil sample or above ground biomass yet. We are, as you'll see, very actively doing this research, and so I don't have it all processed and back yet. What else we measured? We looked at aggregate stability. And so this is blown up. Oh, I usually have it right here. This scale is that this is like just a fraction of an inch in diameter. And so again, that thinking like what happens when a raindrop hits you, this scale, this size is sort of that one raindrop dimension. Like what is happening with this piece of soil where one raindrop is going to really affect it. And so we look at when we submerge this amount of soil, is it going to break apart or is it going to suck that water up and hold onto its structure? And aggregate stability is related to both some of the chemical and physical factors, but very related to biological activity. So again, all of those sugars and the activity of microbes can really glue soil particles together and make them very strong. And it's kind of amazing, these tiny little clods of soil, what they can actually withstand. Not only do we submerge them, we then like drag them in and out after 5 minutes, and some of them are still holding together even after we've very much disrupted them in how they think about the water or how they relate to the water. So we looked at aggregate stability. We also looked at infiltration rate. So infiltration rate is measured by pounding a metal ring into the soil a couple of inches deep. That gives us a fixed volume of soil that's now taking in the water that we add. We usually add an inch at a time and see how long it takes for it to infiltrate. Then we add a second inch, and that can tell us when the soil is already saturated, how long can that go in? How long does it take for that to go in? Goodness. And so just a quick reality check. If we're in a place like New Mexico, where we have generally not abundant water, do we want our infiltration rate to be high, or do we want our infiltration rate to be low? Do we want water to go into the soil quickly, or do we want water to go into the soil more slowly? Quick or slow? Oh, interesting. All right. Quick, slow. Love it. I know, it depends on how you ask the question, right? So if you're thinking about a whole inch of soil, or sorry, a whole inch of water, if it's not going into the soil, what's it doing? It's probably going to run off unless you're in a perfectly flat area. So most people in New Mexico want water to go into the soil as quickly as possible so that it can get accessed by the roots and by the other microbes, versus it rains, it might just evaporate right back off if it doesn't go deep, or it rains and then it just runs right off and you get sheet flow, and that's carrying the soil particles away, and that's carrying all the other good things somewhere else, not on your field. Great. So we usually want infiltration rate to increase. We usually want lots of aggregate stability, and we really usually want a high infiltration rate. All right. And then last but not least, the whole impetus of this project, these are the overly honest methods. I read this paper by Kornecki and found this diagram, and I thought it was so cool that I wanted to design an experiment so that I could use this contour gauge only sort of thing, but it certainly inspired me. So this is a device to measure erosion or accretion. So you fix the edges in place with stakes. So they're at a fixed distance and a fixed balanced height. And then you have a bunch of rulers stuck here, and then you drop a dowel in and you record how deep it's going. And so when you do that year after year, you can see if anything that you've been doing up slope has affected the dimensions of this channel. And so what we would want, if we're really healing this head cut and starting to slow water down and have the sediment build back up, we would start to see over time that this channel would become shallower through time, and we would be accreting soil. So that's what this is used for. It is a fun and also heavy and cumbersome device. All right, so that's what we looked at. so getting here to the end, I can't believe I took up a whole hour already. You know, I love talking about all this stuff. For now, of the 5 plots, I'm just going to talk about one site. This is Tedford Farm. It's up in northern New Mexico. You can see it's really sandy and easily eroded. The BLM put a dam for flood control in the late 70s, and it completely changed the hydrology of this valley. And so we get these channels where they never were before. And so this landowner was excited to try to start shoring up some of the fields that used to be chili fields and may again be chili fields. So what was exciting is, even amidst the fact that we're in, of course, a really profound sort of 20-year drought, in the course of this experiment, between when we put in these structures and measured it, we actually got sort of meaningful precipitation. That was sort of my worry, is that we would put all this stuff in and then it wouldn't rain. And you can see there were a couple of months where it was a little nerve-wracking that we weren't actually getting anything that would cause erosion. But then we got some really nice events in the last couple of months. So when we look at aggregate stability, first we'll orient to these charts. We've got our control plots, control plus seeds. So controls are all blue. Then we've got mulching is in the yellow. Again, no seeds and then added seeds. And then compost is in brown, whether we add seeds or not. And on the y-axis here, we have the change in aggregate stability. So we had a baseline value, and then how did it change from 1 year in the course of the experiment. And in this case, we can see that there's really not any difference in the change in aggregate stability. What's interesting is that this site ended up, so just a couple of weeks ago when we monitored this, we maxed out almost every single thing that we tried. So this combination of precipitation really led to the soil microbes sort of across the board improving. And so there was not a strong difference in control or adding our organic amendments, because sort of I'm saying that the environmental conditions were so conducive to those soil microbes binding the soil together that our treatments didn't really have an effect, which is pretty interesting. The next couple of slides, I'm going to give another huge caveat, is that these are just one replicate. So these are examples of the kind of data that we're going to get, but this is not final. This is going to head towards a peer-reviewed publication. Part of the reason that I'm letting it be recorded is that I'm being really clear that this is pilot data. And so don't quote me on this is going to be what the final results are. This is a single example replicate that we can start looking at. So we've got this infiltration rate. We looked at how fast it infiltrated in 2021, and then the remaining bars are our control, mulch, and compost plots. Again, I talked about that first inch versus the second inch. So the first inch of infiltration rate is when the soil's pretty dry and the water's filling up those air pockets. And so it actually goes pretty quick. Our infiltration rate is pretty high. And then the second inch is when those air pore space is already filled, and now it's the physics of how the water is going in is a little bit different. In general, we were expecting that organic material would increase infiltration rate. And with this single replicate, we're certainly not seeing that. But again, we need to process the data, not just from the other replicates from the Tedford site, but the other 4 ranches, to really get a sense of how these organic amendments are affecting infiltration rate. But I will say that this single replicate is really different than what we're finding in our other organic amendment trials, which is that infiltration rate is increasing dramatically when we add compost to the soils. So this was surprising to see, even with just a single replicate, that our control plots were so much different than our organic amendment plots. Very different than our other studies are showing. Looking at surface cover, sort of a major difference is the blue, which is bare, versus sort of everything else that's not bare. So did a raindrop hit a plant before it hit the soil, or did it hit a dead plant before it hit the soil, or did it just hit the soil? And so from here, you can start to sort of squint and see that some of these mulch, especially mulch plus seeds, seems like it's potentially adding that barrier to the soil, right? The other interesting thing is looking at perennial grass and perennial forb versus the annuals or the dead plants, right? We really did not see very much perennial grass or perennial forb coming in. And this is something I'll come back to, but it's, you know, we added a lot of seed to these plots. And from this data and just from walking around these plots, we didn't really see any germination and establishment of the plants we seeded in, even after a year, even in favorable conditions, and even when we added organic amendments. So this was, I think, a useful thing to think about of where do we want to invest? What's the biggest bang for our buck? And again, these are just the very most preliminary data, but just from walking around the sites, it makes me wonder if there's something else we need to be thinking about for getting those plants to establish upslope. So, and last, we have our erosion or accretion. So this, I'm gonna just do one plot as an example. We have our distance across the channel is the X and the depth. So when we're looking at this plot, it's like we're standing in the channel looking at it straight on, right? And so we have two lines. We have the baseline in 2021, and then we have the new measurement in 2022. And so you can see in all of the areas where 2022 is higher than 2021, we actually built up some sediment that ideally we have slowed the water down enough that even though water is traveling through, it's not scouring, it's potentially actually slow enough that it's depositing some sediment into this channel. So that's really exciting. So when the red line is above the blue line, we're getting accumulation. And then of course here we have that this side of this slope actually eroded further from 2021 to 2022. Excuse me. And so we can actually add all of these up and get a sort of net accumulation or removal. So that's what I'm going to show next. So here we have control plus seeds, mulch plus seeds, compost plus seeds. My same old caveat, this is just one replicate of each of these treatments. But we can start to see, even though these channels are often pretty differently shaped, these poor compost plots really lost quite a bit of soil in this 1 year, versus some of these others that actually did build back up some of that accretion. So again, I'm not going to say that compost didn't work. I'm just going to say this is the kind of information that we're going to get in the next couple of months, and we will update you all when we get the final information. But it's an interesting way to think about it, and hopefully food for thought for those of you who are interested in this kind of thing. So with that, I am going to close up by reminding of the principles, right? We saw just a few tastes of data, but the principles is what I would love for you to walk away with, that we want to think really holistically when we're making management interventions. because these feedback cycles are at the intersection of a lot of different cycles. So when we can think more holistically, we may have better outcomes than we would if we just focus on one aspect. So again, this idea, so many people have worked on this, is this idea of working from the top of the watershed down as of having these, of having bigger impacts. Again, we have this sort of microcosm of the processes in the soil. How many of those can we address when we're working? And then anyone who knows me will be shocked that I got this far in this talk without talking about the healthy soil principles. But using the healthy soil principles as ways to think about what your management is doing for the soil ecosystem is really useful. And I'm happy to talk more about that. Otherwise, come back. So I'll just close with a couple more observations. One, I don't know if you can see in here, silt accumulated in the structures right away. The very first time it rained, we started getting silt accumulated at the top of these structures. So that was truly amazing to me. I had never, I hadn't done this for decades like some people have who've been doing this work. So it was really cool. It really felt very rewarding. And I think a lot of the ranches who were involved in this noticed that as being something that was really rewarding, is that the sediment was accumulating really rapidly, which is what it's designed to do, and it works. The other thing that people noted is that putting a bunch of rocks where horses or cattle or sheep were used to going down changed their patterns, and so we're not just affecting the rainfall and the hydrology patterns. Again, like even one more step of that holistic concept is we're thinking of how the animals are moving around on the landscape. And then something I mentioned before, but and I think this is true in all of restoration, is how do we get dryland plants to germinate? Man, I gave them a bunch of fertilizer and a bunch of mulch, and I still couldn't get them to germinate in a decent rainfall year. So anyway, love to talk more about that. But with that, I will close. I'm going to come into the chat and look at some of those questions, and then, but feel free to come off of mute, and would love to have a conversation for the next 13 minutes or so, or 23 minutes or so. Thank you all so much for being here. And let's see. Becoming hydrophobic faster than the mineral soil. With being in a drier environment, do you think that compost is becoming hydrophobic faster than the mineral soil? In practice, so the compost I had in here was like in a little plastic bag in my garage. That's probably not the best way to store compost before giving a presentation. One thing is we use very little. We used about 1/4 of an inch, so it's really a dusting. So we're not creating a big, thick barrier of compost. So I certainly didn't notice things being hydrophobic. I think it'll be interesting to go to our drier site in southern New Mexico, because I think they've gotten less rain. And that's where I think if it's just been baking and baking and baking and not ever getting water, that's where it's probably been more likely to change some of its chemical characteristics. But either way, it is very thin dusting. And so hopefully that wasn't like creating an impermeable barrier on these areas. Oh, great, thank you. In the compost scenarios, was the measurement taken after the compost was applied? And if so, how was it applied? Yes, surface dressed. So we did the old jiggle the shovel across the plot. So we just did it by hand for the sake of this scale. We did not mix it with soil. Going back to this principles of healthy soil, we were trying to minimize disturbance. So just adding it to the top rather than turning it in. We've had really good success with adding compost to the top. We've seen some really neat results, 80% increase in above ground biomass in a year for example, with just top dressing in ambient precipitation. So it seems like it's been working well enough. And then what I didn't tell you all was this was after a year. All of these results are after 1 full year. Great. Yeah, man, why the seeds didn't germinate? And the compost being a match. Yeah, that's certainly an interesting thought. The seeds didn't germinate anywhere, so it wasn't just about the compost, at least in the data we have so far. I've got to go to the other 4 sites. Hopefully there are some places that had better germination than the Tedford site. So, I mean, I think broadly, when people try to understand germination in dryland soils, we have to think at such a different time scale, right? It's like what we think of as a good year may still not be the right timing of wet that lasts, and then heat, and then a little bit more wet that actually, when we get the sort of big bumper crops of new perennial growth, right? So many of these plants are actually just, sort of calving off rather than having growth from new seed germination. So yeah, I think it's like definitely the sort of golden ticket if we can really figure out how to jumpstart new germination of perennial plants. But so far with this one site, we have not solved that problem. Hopefully with the other couple sites, maybe we'll get a little closer. Compost, a commercially available product. So yes, it was. So we use, if you're in New Mexico, there's a great company called Soilutions, and they do, it's windrow composting. So they're aerating by turning with heavy machinery. We've also used Reunity Resources that does an aerated static pile composting. We have not done any of the like long-term static, the Johnson Sioux. I'm super interested in understanding that. We haven't gotten there yet. Part of the reason we picked the aerated version of compost is it tends to be quicker, right? Like the Reunity can get finished compost in 90 days. And so at scale, if we were trying to get one of the commercial dairies at New Mexico to start doing industrial stair composting, we need to be processing that pretty quickly versus having a long static period. So I think this gets to another one of my principles, which is that any kind of, as long as people will do it, compost is good. If you don't do it, then you're not getting any benefit of composting. So we just picked one sort of aspect to look at, which was something that was already happening at a commercial scale, which sort of demonstrates that it's possible to do this at a commercial scale. We will have the C to N ratio. The poor Colorado State University Soils Lab changed directors, went through COVID, and they're now moving buildings. And so I just got an email from them today. They sent me a whole bunch of data on the compost, and they hadn't sent the C to N ratio yet. So I was like, are you going to send me that? And they were like, we'll get it to you. We're sorry. Anyway, so we'll have that that's a really important metric of compost is the C to N ratio. And I'll know of anybody trying stuff like this. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but does anyone who's involved in this project want to mention anything else they noticed or like?
I have one more. I have one more quick question for you.
Yeah.
It looks like most of the tests you guys did were relatively small erosion projects. I mean, is there a point where a larger project would have a different approach? I mean, are we talking pretty small scale with this, or is this something that you could scale up to do huge?
Yeah. Oh man, that's always the in some cases the actual $1 million question. These structures, from what I know, really top out to still being able to like human manipulate the stones. So that's what we were focusing on, was these, you know, if you and your friends have a couple hours and a, you know, got a delivery of rocks, you can knock those out. There are, of course, sort of analogous boulder scale that are put in place with heavy machinery. To me, the principles of top to bottom and the fact that organic amendments are playing nicely with all aspects of how soil functions, I don't see any reason that we wouldn't. But then it gets to the cost, right? It's like cutting down a juniper and dragging the branches over is really different than if you would have to bring things in from off site. And so I think it's, as with so many things, that holistic consideration of what are our goals, what is available to us already, are going to be where it matters for scaling. But it would be amazing, yeah, because I mean, there's so much organic waste that is not doing anything. And so if we can start using it to hold water in the desert, I would love that. And Emily asked, did you see any differences between areas with animal impact and not? We didn't, we didn't do any exclosures, so we don't have any sort of scientific side-by-side comparison of really keeping animals out. Behaviorally, there's places that the animals, at least on the site, didn't like to walk around versus did. I don't think I noticed. Anecdotally, from our, like, the rest of our organic amendments trials that we've been doing over the last 3 years, is that grazers will actually preferentially graze in places with compost, and it's likely due to the added nutrient value of the forage. And so that is an important consideration, is that we may have put seeds down, added compost. If those little tiny babies tried to germinate and then immediately got eaten, then of course that would be why we're not seeing it. We don't have the treatments to be able to disentangle that. At least at this site, we didn't see sort of that like mow line that we've seen at other sites. But yeah, it's certainly something that would impact our ability to get new perennials to germinate, is if the animals are just coming along and eating them. Was there anything else, Emily, that did you notice anything?
I didn't necessarily notice anything pertaining to the animal impact, but I wonder how many of these sites ended up being areas that were actually trails to and from water, or just up and down the the hillside. And when animals started to go around them, are we going to start to see just another a movement of that erosion to a different spot?
Yeah,
out a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you. There certainly is. We sort of specifically at this site at Tedford put one where the horses love to go up and down, and they were, as horses are, they got in a little snit and just made a brand new trail that was the very next place, and then they rejoined the original trail. So yes, I think animal behavior is certainly going to play into this, and that's where, again, thinking at scale and like what's really important on the landscape. So for example, there's a really big channel that's actually affecting the house in the next 50 years, will actually affect the house. And so probably armoring along that, and anything we can do to get the animals to like stop using the same trail that is heading towards the house, it's probably going to be good. Even if they create a new trail, like we're slowing down that sort of press impact that we'll see here. So, but yes, I wonder if you can, I don't know. I mean, and this is the other piece that when we watch that whole video series, is these aren't intended to be a one and done. It is really intended to be top down and integrated, right? It's like you would have an erosion control structure that's dealing with a head cut, and then you would have one rock dam that is at the straight part of the channel, and then you would have another structure that's spreading it out when it gets to the, so it's like, it's not just one. And so maybe when we sort of think at that scale, we put the structure at the top of this trail that the animals always use, and then maybe we put another one rock dam so that their behavior is having to become more torturous, which means that the water running down it is going to go slower than the point A to point B that they usually do.
Yeah, perhaps like when we put rocks within those trails, we kind of have to extend it a little bit off to the right or the left, so that then they kind of have to walk around in a meandering pattern that kicks water off the trail, but isn't necessarily, like you said, at that grade where it's going to just down cut more.
Yeah.
They almost use their trailing as like induced meandering or something.
Right, that would be cool. Next Western Stair project.
Yeah.
Although, man, in places where you would have enough rock on the landscape to easily do that, they're probably all meandering anyway because they're like picking their way through the rocks. Anyway.
If I can, I have one more question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it kind of ties into that. In a location where you don't have rock, or say you have a large property and you're fairly remote, so you're not going to schlep in, all the rock for your your rock bed, but you might have juniper, you might have logs there. Is there any merit to blocking up the logs small and filling, building your bed out of the log rather than using the rock, using what's there?
Yeah, I think absolutely using what's there. One of those guidelines actually talks about, I think it's Lynn, maybe the slope wetlands one. They actually use logs, and you sort of, again, not a hydrologist, but you put them perpendicular to the slope so that the water's running through it. So I think yes, that again, and it's that thinking holistically. It's like what's really more beneficial: running a heavy truck filled with rock across my delicate landscape to get the rocks there, versus let me use what I have and do the best I can. The other thing I really like about these is they're, especially in the small scale, it's not a ton of effort. If they do fail, and you can actually, I moved the slide. There is one where we didn't actually build it high enough up, and a new tiny channel did form on the side, just exactly like he said it would in the video. And so what are we going to do? As soon as we finish this experiment, we'll just put more rocks up on the side. It's like, we'll just sort of, the spirit of curiosity and iterative improvement, I think is alive and well in this methodology. You don't want to do that if you're investing with heavy machinery and bringing in the large boulders. You want to do it right the first time. But I think, these are pretty enjoyable to build at this small scale. Awesome. I'm going to stick around for another couple minutes. Thank you all so much for being here. And I think people are starting to come in for the next one. All right, Lynn, up next. Economic success
with regenerative ranching, regenerative grazing. Yep. Great. So we'll be back here in about half an hour. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Eva. It was an awesome presentation.
Thanks, y'all.
Hi, thanks for your good work, Eva. I'm a slow typer.
Yeah, I'm a slow reader. I was just getting there. Yes, the experimental trial is reductionist. I agree. I am certainly, Quivira hired me knowing that I am a trained researcher, and the way I think is to, do X by Y and see what happens to Z. And I think the piece that I've really appreciated is when people point out that it is reductionist, and that there are so many ways to think about a question. And my view is we need everyone. We need everyone. We need people who have done the trials iteratively on the ground without replication, absolutely, to share their knowledge. And I believe that there's still a place for people with the scientific training that I have, which is reductionist, to get at sort of effect sizes. And, you know, if there is something that just isn't worth trying, I would rather me do that than someone who's trying to grow food for us. Like if it truly is that the buying and applying compost is so expensive and has a small impact, I would rather that I do that on my replicated small scale than someone trying it on their ranch. So I think that hopefully there still is a role for all of us at getting at some of these holistic questions.
Yeah, I've struggled with the same things, and you're doing great work. So I hope my ideas are seen as I don't know. Oh, here's what I've found is really helpful. If I help introduce these 6 principles of soil health to people, and that there are things you can see, you can quickly judge whether they're present. Do we have good soil cover? What's the disturbance regime that's occurring here? What kind of plant diversity? And I try to emphasize not just plant diversity, species diversity and functional diversity, because the difference is huge and the implications for ecosystem function is huge. But that link that Alan Savory talked about so much, the link between healthy grasslands or rangelands and herding animals, I think needs to be emphasized more than what NRCS came up with as 4 soil health principles, because there really is that link on these expansive lands between getting good litter down on the ground and transporting nutrients to other parts of the landscape through the manure and the urine to advance succession. And so to me, that's a critical aspect of soil health that we need to add. And then this idea that management has to be holistic, or we're going to win all these little battles and get our butts kicked in the overall war. And we're at war right now in terms of things like climate change and biodiversity loss and the social issues and war and poverty and homelessness. I mean, we got a lot of real issues. So I don't know. I found it really helpful to add those 2 extra principles when I'm introducing land managers or Joe Schmo out of the city to soil health principles, so that they can begin to connect with it themselves in what they do, how they manage, and what they buy.
Yeah, absolutely. And in New Mexico, in our Healthy Soil Act, there's 5 in New Mexico, and the grazing animals is its own, incorporate grazing animals is its own 5th one, which usually gets lumped in with the biodiversity piece. Yeah, and that context matters. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm cheering you on, but
yeah, I appreciate it.
Thinking, I've made so many mistakes trying to advance the thinking, the regenerative thinking, that I wanted to share some things I thought have worked well for me.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, that is fantastic. And hopefully you were here at the beginning where I was like, bring everyone's experience and expert into the pot. Like, that's what we're here for. That's what Regenerate Conference is here for. Yeah, well, great.
I so much appreciate those the tech guide section that Quivira Coalition has. There's just some great stuff in there, and wish it was more well known, but that's our job, right? Give them the link And
I know. I was like, do I just show the video? I'm like, people probably don't know that we have these videos. I'm going to show the video. So yeah, try to raise awareness. Well, I think I'm going to jump off so that the next speaker can get ready. But thank you again. Again, feel free to reach out. Happy to have a further conversation. Otherwise, I will see everyone. Well, tomorrow I'm giving another one about a very similar topic, but not exactly the same. And otherwise, I'll be at Regenerate next week. So take care, everyone. Have a lovely week.